Officer kicks out a black janitor from a restricted area in an FBI office, his tone dripping with arrogance and dismissal. "What are you doing here?" he barked, glaring at the woman pushing a cleaning cart. The hallway, filled with bustling agents and officers, suddenly grew quieter as his commanding voice drew attention. "I'm doing my job," the woman replied calmly, her composure unshaken. "Your job. This is a restricted area," the officer sneered, stepping closer. "You don't belong here. Who let you in?" "I have clearance to be here," she stated firmly, meeting his gaze. The officer chuckled mockingly. "Clearance? Don't make me laugh. You're just a janitor. Take your cart and leave before I have you removed." The woman remained calm, though her steady voice carried a warning. "You're making a mistake. I suggest you think carefully about what you're saying." But the officer wasn't listening. "A mistake?" he scoffed. "You're lucky I haven't called security already. Now, move." Before she could respond, a voice from down the hall interrupted the heated exchange. "We're ready for you, Supervisor." The officer's smug expression froze. He glanced between the woman and the colleague who had called out, his confusion giving way to a sinking realization. Without a word, the woman calmly pushed her cart aside and walked confidently toward the meeting room. The hallway buzzed with murmurs as the officer stood frozen, watching the janitor step into a meeting where she was clearly in charge. The woman at the center of this unfolding drama was far from ordinary. Known for her unassuming demeanor, she had risen through the ranks of the FBI, earning her reputation as a brilliant strategist and a fair, respected leader. Her intelligence and dedication to justice had made her one of the most effective supervisors in the Bureau, but she had never allowed her position to inflate her ego. Instead, she often chose to blend in, observing people and situations firsthand before making decisions. She believed in leading by example, often taking a low-profile approach to her work. Her plain attire and quiet presence weren't a disguise. They were a reflection of her values. To her, actions mattered far more than appearances. In stark contrast stood the officer who had confronted her. Arrogant and dismissive, he prided himself on his authority, wielding it without much thought. As a local law enforcement officer assigned to assist at the FBI building, he was used to flexing his power in his jurisdiction. Quick to judge and even quicker to act, he relied on assumptions rather than facts to guide his behavior. The moment he saw the woman pushing the cleaning cart, he had made up his mind. To him, she was just a janitor, someone who didn't belong in a high-security space. His tone was harsh, his demeanor condescending, and his actions reeked of entitlement. The setting of their confrontation was the bustling hallway of a high-security FBI building. This wasn't just any office. It was a hub of critical operations, where agents and law enforcement personnel came and went with purpose. The atmosphere was always charged with urgency, and appearances often dictated how people were perceived. Local police officers were frequently assigned to assist with security or deliver reports, but they were guests in a space governed by FBI protocols. The tension between the officer's local authority and the Bureau's federal jurisdiction was evident in his behavior. He saw himself as someone who needed to assert control even in a place where he held limited power. But today, his assumptions were about to cost him dearly. As the woman disappeared into the meeting room, the hallway buzzed with speculation. "Did you hear that?" one person whispered. "She's a supervisor," another nodded. "She's one of the best in the Bureau. He just messed with the wrong person." The officer, still standing where she left him, felt the weight of their words. His earlier bravado was nowhere to be found. As the realization of his mistake began to sink in, the officer's disbelief lingered as the janitor walked confidently into the meeting room. He stood frozen for a moment, grappling with the realization that he had dismissed someone who was clearly more important than he'd assumed. But just hours earlier, the scene had been entirely different. It had all started when the woman, dressed in plain clothes and pushing a cleaning cart, moved through the hallway on her usual rounds. The officer, noticing her presence near a restricted area, immediately decided to intervene. His voice was loud and sharp, cutting through the noise of the busy FBI building. "Excuse me, what are you doing here?" he demanded, stepping in front of her cart. The woman stopped, looking up at him with a calm but firm expression. "I'm doing my job," she replied evenly, gesturing to the cart. "This is a restricted area," he shot back. "You're not authorized to be here." "I have clearance," she replied, her voice steady. "There's no issue." The officer's eyebrows raised, his smirk returning. "Clearance? Sure you do," he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "You're just a janitor. You don't belong in restricted areas." The officer's dismissive attitude didn't faze her, but his volume was drawing attention. A few staff members paused in their tracks, glancing at the exchange. The woman sighed softly, her voice calm but resolute. "I suggest you check with someone before jumping to conclusions," she said. "I don't need to check with anyone," he snapped, cutting her off. "You're a security risk. Show me some ID, now." She hesitated for a moment, then reached into her pocket, producing a standard building access badge. "Here," she said. "This should suffice." He barely glanced at the badge before waving it off. "This doesn't prove anything," he said. "Anyone could have gotten their hands on one of these. I assure you, I have every right to be here," she said firmly, though her voice remained composed. "But, if you're so concerned, feel free to escalate this to someone higher up." Her calm demeanor only seemed to infuriate him further. "Don't get smart with me," he barked, his voice rising. "You're lucky I haven't called security yet." As the confrontation continued, flashes of her past filled her mind. She remembered her early days in the bureau when being a young black woman, in a field dominated by older white men, had meant facing constant scrutiny. Despite her stellar academic background and impressive achievements, her abilities had been questioned at every turn. One particular memory stood out: her first major assignment, where a senior agent had outright dismissed her strategy, only to see it succeed beyond expectations. His grudging acknowledgement had been a turning point, but it had also underscored the uphill battle she faced to be taken seriously. Over the years, she had built a reputation for excellence, climbing the ranks through sheer determination and skill. Her decision to maintain a grounded, unassuming presence wasn't just a personal preference. It was a way to ensure that her actions, not her title, defined her. But moments like this reminded her that appearances still held power, even in spaces where merit should reign supreme. The officer's behavior continued to escalate. "Move your cart and get out of here," he ordered loudly, drawing more attention from the surrounding staff. "You're causing a disruption." "I'm not moving anywhere," she said, her tone still steady but firm. "And I'm not causing a disruption. You are." A ripple of murmurs spread through the hallway as staff members exchanged glances, sensing the growing tension. The officer's face reddened as he leaned in closer. "Listen, lady," he said, lowering his voice but not his aggression. "You're not in charge here. So, unless you want me to throw you out myself, you'd better—" He was cut off by a voice from the end of the hallway. "We're ready for you, Supervisor." The officer froze mid-sentence, his mouth hanging open as the words registered. He slowly turned toward the voice, then back to the woman, who was now calmly removing her gloves and setting them on the cart. "Excuse me," she said, her tone measured as she stepped past him. I have a meeting to attend." The murmurs in the hallway grew louder as she walked away, leaving the officer standing there, stunned and speechless. His earlier bravado crumbled under the weight of the realization that the janitor he had been berating was, in fact, his superior. The officer watched the woman walk into the meeting room, his confusion etched into his face. Just moments earlier, he had been berating her, confident in his authority. Now, a ripple of murmurs filled the hallway as employees exchanged glances, wondering what had just unfolded. The officer's chest tightened as he realized this might not end the way he had assumed. Before she entered the meeting, the officer had been doubling down on his aggressive stance. "I've told you to leave this area," he barked, his voice louder now, ensuring everyone in the hallway could hear. "If you don't comply, I'll have no choice but to remove you myself." The woman remained perfectly composed, her calmness contrasting sharply with his anger. "You're making a mistake," she said quietly, "and I suggest you stop before you make it worse." Her words only seemed to provoke him further. "A mistake?" he scoffed. "Lady, you're a cleaning lady wandering into restricted areas. I'm protecting this building from people like you." The crowd, now more engaged, watched silently as the tension escalated. A few staff members whispered among themselves, uneasy but unwilling to step in. One agent shook his head and muttered, "This isn't going to end well for him." The woman met the officer's glare, her tone steady but firm. "I have every right to be here," she said. "And whether you realize it or not, this interaction is going to reflect more on you than it will on me." He laughed derisively, shaking his head. "You don't get it, do you? I don't need to explain myself to you. I've got a job to do, and I'm not going to let you get in the way of that." She took a step back, her expression unreadable. "You're right about one thing," she said. "You do have a job to do. The question is whether you'll still have it by the end of the day." Before the officer could respond, a voice interrupted the exchange. "Supervisor, we're ready for you." The officer froze, his eyes darting toward the voice. A senior agent stood at the end of the hallway, addressing the woman with a tone of deference and respect. The officer's face flushed as he looked back at her, his confidence faltering for the first time. What did he just call you?" he stammered. The woman tilted her head slightly, her calm demeanor never wavering. "Supervisor," she said simply. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a meeting to attend." She stepped past him, her movements graceful and deliberate. The hallway erupted into hushed whispers as the staff who had been watching pieced together what was happening. The officer remained rooted to the spot, his face pale, as he struggled to process what he had just heard. Inside the meeting room, the tension reached a boiling point. The officer had been summoned to the same high-level briefing, unaware of who would be leading it. As he entered the room, still reeling from the hallway incident, his eyes locked onto her at the head of the table. The senior agent who had addressed her earlier stood and gestured toward her. "Everyone, I'd like to introduce our supervisor. She's here to oversee today's operations and provide guidance on the ongoing investigation." The room fell silent as all eyes turned to the woman, who now exuded an undeniable authority. The officer's heart sank as the realization hit him like a freight train. She wasn't just any supervisor. She was the one in charge of the entire building. The woman glanced around the room, her gaze briefly settling on the officer before moving on. "Thank you," she said, her voice calm but commanding. "Before we begin, I'd like to address something important." Her eyes returned to the officer, who now looked as though he wished he could disappear. "Moments ago," she began, "I was confronted in the hallway by someone who made a series of assumptions based solely on appearances. These assumptions were not only incorrect but also deeply unprofessional." The room remained silent, the weight of her words hanging heavily in the air. The officer's colleagues glanced at him, their expressions ranging from shock to disapproval. "Let me be clear," she continued. "In this building, we operate on facts, not biases. We treat everyone with respect, regardless of their role, their appearance, or our personal assumptions about them. Anything less is unacceptable." The officer's face burned as she turned to him directly. "Do you have anything to say for yourself?" she asked. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Finally, he managed to stammer, I didn't realize who you were." "That's exactly the problem," she replied, her tone sharp but controlled. "Your behavior shouldn't depend on knowing someone's title. Respect and professionalism are non-negotiable, no matter who you're dealing with." The room remained silent as she moved on, shifting the focus to the briefing at hand. The officer sat quietly, his earlier arrogance completely gone. His colleagues avoided making eye contact with him, clearly embarrassed by his actions. Outside the room, the story of what had happened spread quickly through the building. Staff members shared the tale in whispers, many expressing satisfaction that the officer's behavior had been called out so publicly. She handled that so well. One agent remarked, "I can't believe he thought he could talk to her like that." Another nodded. "I hope this is a wake-up call for him, and anyone else who thinks they can judge someone based on appearances." The meeting concluded with the officer sitting stiffly in his chair, unable to shake the humiliation of being exposed in front of his peers. Meanwhile, the woman walked out of the room with the same quiet confidence she had displayed from the beginning. For her, the confrontation wasn't just about defending herself. It was about setting an example and upholding the values she believed in. The officer sat stiffly at the table, his mind replaying the supervisor's pointed words. He had made assumptions, and now the entire room knew the consequences of his arrogance. But as the meeting continued, the depth of her authority and her story was about to unfold in ways that would leave him and everyone else in stunned silence. After the meeting, the supervisor addressed a smaller group, including senior staff, local law enforcement liaisons, and, uncomfortably, the officer himself. She stood calmly at the head of the room, exuding quiet authority. "Before we discuss next steps on the operation," she began, "I believe it's important to address what just happened, not because of my position, but because it reflects a broader issue." Her tone was measured, her words deliberate. "As many of you know, I prefer to keep a low profile. It's not uncommon for me to walk the halls or observe day-to-day operations without drawing attention to my title. It allows me to see how people truly interact, how they treat one another when they think no one is watching." She paused, her gaze moving slowly across the room. "What happened today is a reminder of why that approach matters. Assumptions were made. Respect was withheld. And this isn't an isolated incident." The officer shifted uncomfortably in his seat, the weight of her words pressing down on him. Her calm, yet commanding tone left no room for excuses. The supervisor continued, her voice unwavering. "I've received complaints about certain behaviors, arrogance, prejudice, a lack of professionalism. And today, I saw those complaints validated." The room grew tense. A senior agent nodded subtly, clearly aware of the reports she was referencing. The officer's face burned with embarrassment, but he couldn't find the courage to respond. Her gaze softened slightly as she addressed the group as a whole. "I didn't reach this position by luck," she said, her tone shifting to something more personal. "I've spent my career working through layers of systemic barriers that many of you will never face." A flashback crossed her mind, her first day as a field agent. She remembered walking into the room, the youngest and only black woman among seasoned operatives, the skeptical stares, the patronizing comments, and the unspoken challenge to prove herself had been a constant weight on her shoulders. "I've had my intelligence questioned because of how I look," she said aloud, her voice calm but firm. "I've been underestimated, ignored, and overlooked. But every time I've chosen to let my work speak for itself, and that's what's brought me here." She glanced at the officer again, her tone sharpening slightly. Respect shouldn't be earned only after someone's credentials are revealed. It should be a baseline expectation, something you offer to everyone, no matter their role, their appearance, or your assumptions about them. The room was silent, the gravity of her words sinking in. Another memory came to her, a critical moment during her rise in the FBI. She had led a high-stakes operation that had saved lives, but even afterward, a senior colleague had casually remarked, "Not bad for someone so young." She had smiled politely, but the comment had stayed with her, a reminder of how far she still had to go to break through biases. Yet, instead of letting these experiences embitter her, she had used them as fuel. She had built her reputation on integrity, fairness, and a relentless commitment to justice. And now, she used her position not just to lead, but to challenge the very systems that had once tried to limit her. The officer finally found his voice, though it was barely audible. "I didn't realize, I didn't know who you were." Her gaze locked onto his, calm but piercing. "And that's the problem," she replied. "You shouldn't need to know someone's title to treat them with basic respect. What you saw was a uniform, a cart, and a face that didn't fit your expectations. And based on that, you made a decision. That decision speaks volumes about your character." His shoulders slumped, her words cutting deeper than any reprimand could. The supervisor turned back to the group. "This is a learning opportunity," she said, "not just for one person, but for all of us. Bias is insidious. It creeps into our actions, our decisions, even when we think we're above it. The only way to fight it is to acknowledge it and actively work against it." She straightened, her voice growing more formal. "I expect every person in this room to reflect on today's events and consider how they can do better. This isn't just about individual behavior. It's about creating a culture where respect and fairness are the standard, not the exception." As the meeting concluded, the officer remained seated, his mind racing with regret and embarrassment. The supervisor walked past him, pausing briefly. "You have a choice now," she said quietly. "You can let this moment define you, or you can let it change you. I hope you choose wisely." She left the room, her presence lingering long after she was gone. The officer stared after her, realizing that her words carried more weight than he could have imagined. This wasn't just about his mistake. It was about the broader need for change, both in himself and in the system he represented. The meeting ended with a heavy silence. The officer, still seated, struggled to process the reprimand he had just received from the supervisor. Her words about respect and fairness echoed in his mind, forcing him to confront the arrogance and prejudice that had fueled his actions. Later that day, the officer was formally reprimanded. His behavior was flagged for immediate review, and he was placed on probation pending mandatory training. The department issued an internal memo stating that all personnel would undergo bias training to ensure such incidents were not repeated. The supervisor took a proactive role, addressing the broader implications of the incident. In a meeting with senior staff, she emphasized the need for systemic change. "This wasn't just about one officer," she said. "It's about the culture we allow to exist. Bias, whether conscious or unconscious, has no place in law enforcement. If we're going to uphold justice, we must start with ourselves." Her words struck a chord. For many in the room, it was a wake-up call. The incident sparked immediate changes, including the implementation of regular training sessions on implicit bias and professional conduct. Policies were updated to reinforce the expectation that every individual, regardless of their role or appearance, be treated with dignity and respect. The officer's colleagues noticed a shift in him after the incident. He became quieter, more introspective. When approached by a co-worker who asked how he was doing, he replied, "I didn't just embarrass myself, I disrespected the principles of this job. I have to do better." For the supervisor, the incident was a reminder of the challenges she had faced throughout her career. She reflected on her journey, from being underestimated as a young black woman in a male-dominated field to becoming a respected leader. Her resilience had been shaped by countless moments like this, moments where she had to rise above prejudice and let her actions speak louder than words. But she knew this wasn't just her fight. It was a fight for everyone who had ever been dismissed, underestimated, or judged unfairly. That knowledge fueled her determination to push for lasting change. In the weeks following the incident, the department saw noticeable improvements. Employees began engaging in open discussions about bias and accountability. The supervisor continued to lead by example, reinforcing the importance of fairness and respect in every interaction. Her message was simple but powerful. Respect isn't earned through rank or status. It's a fundamental right we owe to each other as human beings. If we can't embody that, how can we expect to enforce it? The officer, humbled by the experience, approached the supervisor one day. "I want to apologize again," he said, his voice sincere. "I was wrong. I let my assumptions control me, and I didn't treat you or my role with the respect you deserved." She looked at him, her expression softening slightly. "Acknowledging your mistake is a good start," she said. "Now it's about what you do next. Change doesn't happen overnight, but it begins with a choice. Make the right one." The incident left a lasting impact on the department, serving as a powerful reminder that respect and accountability must be at the core of law enforcement. For the supervisor, it was another step in her ongoing mission to break down barriers and create a culture of fairness and integrity. Weeks after the incident, the supervisor stood before a room of law enforcement officials, her presence commanding but calm. The department had undergone a shift, with new training and policies implemented to ensure respect and professionalism. But she knew lasting change required more than rules. It required a shift in mindset. Humility and respect aren't just optional qualities, she began. They are the foundation of justice. If we, as law enforcement officers, fail to treat everyone with dignity, we undermine the very principles we're sworn to uphold. Her words carried weight, the room hanging on every syllable. Bias doesn't always announce itself loudly, she continued. It hides in assumptions, in snap judgments, in the way we perceive people who don't look or act like us. It's our responsibility to confront it, both in ourselves and in the systems we're a part of. She paused, letting her gaze sweep across the room. The incident that brought us here wasn't an isolated mistake. It was a symptom of a larger issue. But addressing it gives us an opportunity to do better, to be better. Turning her attention to the audience beyond the room, her message was clear. To anyone watching, advocate for fairness. Call out prejudice when you see it. Promote equity in every system you touch. Change doesn't happen by itself. It happens when each of us takes responsibility. As she stepped away from the podium, her words lingered, resonating not just as a call to action, but as a blueprint for a more just and equitable future. Months after the incident, the officer sat in a quiet corner of the precinct, reflecting on how much had changed. The mandatory training sessions had opened his eyes to the biases he had carried for years, biases he hadn't even realized influenced his behavior. The confrontation with the supervisor had been humbling, but it was also a turning point. That day could have ended my career, he thought, but instead, it started something better. He had worked to rebuild trust with his colleagues and approached his role with renewed humility and professionalism. Treating every individual with dignity had become his personal mission, not just a department policy. She didn't just call me out, he often told others. She gave me the chance to change. For the supervisor, the incident had reinforced the importance of her mission. She often reflected on the moment when she calmly stepped into the meeting, knowing the impact it would have. While addressing bias and prejudice could be exhausting, moments like this reminded her why the work mattered. The real change happens in those small, uncomfortable moments, she thought. When people are forced to confront their assumptions, growth becomes possible. She continued her work with the same quiet strength, knowing every step forward brought the system closer to being one where respect and fairness weren't exceptions. They were the rule. The incident left an indelible mark, not just on the officer and the supervisor, but on the entire department. It became a story of humility, growth, and the power of standing up for justice, proving that even the smallest moments could spark meaningful change.